So Carter English here at HiggTalks with my buddy Nick Sunderman. Nick is the founder, CEO of carrotsai.com. Has a really kind of a multitude of things in his background, and so we're going to hash through some of those things, get some advice in terms of entrepreneurship, this particular silo of business, and then we'll kind of let the conversation go from there. So Nick, welcome. Glad you're here.
Glad to be here.
Yeah. So tell me, let's kind of just start from the beginning. You've done a number of things, grew up in Fort Worth, played baseball, but let's start with your first business, kind of the short, high-level version of that, leading into what kind of made you even start thinking about Carrots after being out of, directly running a business for a little while.
Right. Well, you mentioned real briefly that, I did have a short stint playing baseball, and I think the stint went poorly enough that I, in game, would start planning on what my job would be afterwards.
So you're in games thinking,
well, I was a pitcher, and then I was a starting pitcher. So you've got 4 days of not playing, and so you'd sit in the stands and you'd chart pitches, and for all the guys that were not playing well, we would play the game of like, what are we going to do next? And so probably not the best attitude to have, while you're in a career is to start thinking about what's next. But when your ERA is 5, you have no choice but to start thinking about other stuff. But we used to play this game, and we would say like, oh, so-and-so is going to be a athletic director, and so-and-so is going to be a doctor,
right?
And everyone would always laugh and be like, you're definitely going to be an entrepreneur, because I guess I always just sort of had like this mindset ever since I was a kid of like watching something happen, and you would think like, oh, they could charge more for that, or this is how you could do that better, and I think like I would watch the guys like go up and down the aisle selling like ice cream or hot dogs, and I would point out like, oh, if he did it like this, he would make like 20% more money. And they were like, you're such a weirdo. But unfortunately, the same sort of, efficiency didn't translate to my baseball career. But I guess you could say like, the thought process of trying to like start good ideas and things, that started in baseball.
Nice. So you finished playing, and tell us about your first venture there and how that went, and where did even the genesis of that come from?
Right. Yeah. So almost immediately. I mean, a matter of fact, I think really while I was still playing, a teammate and myself had a sort of sports marketing idea, and then like a lot of startups do, that thing quickly evolved. And if you see people, or I think we've all experienced those like power whiteboarding sessions where you get in a room, you start an idea, and then if the computers are turned off and the phones are turned off, 3 hours later you ended up somewhere completely different on the whiteboard than where you had intended, and maybe the problem that you originally went in that room to solve, you're now in a completely different place, but it's a great place. Definitely one of the things I miss about face-to-face over the last year is like that stuff, that free flow and idea exchange isn't quite as easy via Zoom and things like that. But long story short, had this business idea. Over the course of 18 months, I think it really evolved. And just like a lot of people, I had my neighborhood and the city and the schools that I grew up going to in mind. And I didn't do a lot of research or due diligence, and just thought, hey, this is a small little lifestyle business, and I can solve this problem for local schools or athletic departments. And then it turns out that problem was much, much, much bigger. And the solution and product and services that we came up with, it applied to pretty much every school in the United States, including small colleges. So we went from, a vendor on the Fort Worth and Dallas ISD vendor list. Like, we went from doing that to working with, I think, like probably 15, 16,000 high schools, and probably another 10,000 lower level schools, and then a certain number of small colleges.
So what percentage of high schools in the nation then would you say y'all were working with at your height?
I mean, for something like a huge chunk. I mean, literally, a tiny percentage that we weren't doing something with. So, I think the research, this could have changed a lot. I don't know. I know maybe as of a few years ago, there were like 7 million on any given year. There's like 7 million varsity athletes. So now you got to think like that number is way higher than that for sub varsity. But we had a huge chunk of that market share, and then their supporters and so on and so forth. So yeah, it was I think we were selling probably 35 to 40 million products a year.
Jeez,
So
that's a lot of stuff.
right.
Yeah. Okay. So, and I have the benefit, obviously, of I know kind of how this story went, and so I'm going to lead us into where we're trying to go. So, you build this business. You go from you and one other partner, right? Yeah, and then thousands of employees.
Right.
You end up selling the business, and I know from our conversations that. There's kind of a problem that you identified, an employee problem, a people problem, a retention, a motivation problem. Can you speak to what that was and how identifying that problem led into Carrots?
Yeah, absolutely. So just try to make it as quick as possible, but I broke all of the don't do this rules. First 5 people I hired were like friends and family. So all of that. So when your first handful of people are people you're really close to and really well, you can get away with some things that you can't get away with when it's strangers. And so I think good and bad, right? Like I had history with these people, so they really knew a lot about me, and then I was probably able to get away with a level of like casualness that you can't as a business matures. But I think you have to be obsessed with your customer when you start a company, right? I mean, any just kind of like sane person, when you start a company, you should have the responsibility of trying to put forth a product that's really needed. And so we did that. So I was obsessed with customer. Well, as the business went from 5 friends to 500 people, and then maybe 1,000 people, and obviously at that point in time you don't know 95% of them. Everything shifts from being all about the customer to almost kind of that old Starbucks diagram they used to talk about, where if the CEOs and leaders of a business aren't just as obsessed with taking care of their people and building good culture as you are taking care of the client, then that triangle of success stops, right? So it's let me make sure that I'm taking the proper care of my people, environmentally, mentally, resource wise. Let me invest in those people, and then that way they're better fueled to go take care of the client, right? Like you and me trying to manage every single client is not scalable. So for me to condition and train people to go take care of the clients the way you and I would expect, you've got to have a scalable solution.
Right.
And so I definitely know that, early on, it was probably 95% of my time was spent on client, and 5% was probably unfortunately focused on the employees. And by the time I sold the company, it was at least, 60-70% of the hours that I spent in meetings were focused on, HR, benefits, advancement summaries, a more clear organizational chart, just providing an atmosphere of transparency and trying to have people thrive. Definitely easier to do that right from the start. If you let your company evolve and grow to a certain point, I learned this in some ways the hard way, is that if you've let things kind of go for you to then do a 180 and start something. So this time around, I accidentally really had no intentions of being an operator again, but I spent the last 3 years investing in startups and trying to find people that reminded me of my executive team and of myself, and they were at a similar point in their life and had a problem and a product that made people's lives better and a service that was needed. And then I want to go invest in those people. I was doing that over the last 3 years. I started to realize that there are a lot of things that I assumed were just Nick problems that it didn't matter regardless of industry, pharmaceutical, healthcare, landscape, it doesn't matter. Like pick an industry and you're going to see the same sort of people problems. You'll see someone botching employee development. You'll see somebody botching, continuing education and benefits and just all the things that people expect out of a job. You'll see somebody screwing that up, right? So I'd had a program that was real successful inside my business, and I started to one by one deploy that in the 9 or 10 companies that I had invested money in, and really started to see it work.
Yeah.
So called a friend and said, I'm starting to get the real vibe that this could be a business by itself. That's kind of the evolution of how, I went from starting a company to learning a lot on the fly about, a healthy environment for your employees, and then now how to convert that into a business that scales and is a tool for everybody.
Yeah, that's awesome. Okay, so all right, so we're gonna go down 2 lanes here.
Yeah.
One is there's obviously something in you that says, all right, I see this problem, I need to fix it. From you, sitting in on the bench watching guys sell hot dogs, to then building obviously a company full of thousands of employees, to then saying, okay, now I've identified a third problem, now we're going to fix this one.
Right.
So what do you think that thing is in you, or is there a quality that you think is most needed for an entrepreneur to be successful?
Yes. If this one sounds like I have a canned answer, I just answered this to a really close friend the other day.
Nice.
That I have a 5-year-old son, and so I try to make notes for him all the time, and I don't know if he's gonna have any interest in going into business, right? And doesn't really concern me one way or the other. Whatever he wants to do, I want him to be successful. But every successful person I've ever been around, they in their own way were very curious people. And so, that may be you're incredibly curious about learning how to write code, and you've got this hobby that it's tough for a lot of people to do, but you're the type of person that you want to learn it, and so you challenge yourself to do that. Or it could just be like you're curious, like we keep talking about, you're curious about your customer. Everything in business is sort of evergreen, right? It's like when you're 18 or 19, you think like, oh, let me go do this thing and then I'm set up for life. Well, that's just not the way it works.
Yeah.
Like you're only really as good as what you're doing this week and today. And I find that the people that are really curious can sustain that success more often, because I think the runway of in 1980, if you had a business model and it worked a certain way, it may have been 15 years before your business was disrupted.
Right.
And I think now, just news and information travel so fast that, if Uber works, then, 7 months later, there's 40 Ubers.
Yeah.
Right. And so I think like if you're not incredibly curious, then you won't continue to evolve as an individual and as a business. Right. And so I think, at least myself, when I think about like a curious kid in school, like it looks a certain way.
Yeah.
And then when you're an adult and you see, a curious president, CEO, CRO, whatever, it looks a little different, right? That person is gonna it's maybe a little bit more discreet. They don't look like a scientist. You don't look like someone that's doing a lot of exploration, but in their own head, you're just constantly thinking about what's next. Like, what can I do next to make this situation better? And so I think, curiosity, number one. And then I would think, the right little mix there is being an incredibly curious person mixed with the proper amount of tenacity, because, just being curious and then just, R&D, trial and error, that doesn't work.
Yep.
So it's like, you got to have the proper amount of curiosity, then be able to dial it in and grind through tough times. So if you find somebody that's really curious and also very tenacious, more than likely at some point in time, that person's going to get a big win.
Yeah. Yeah, it's funny is kind of an aside to that, like, one of the things that I always say is like that person is the antithesis of what my worst nightmare is. I've always said my greatest fear would be to wake up at age 65, have had just a normal, comfortable job, done, very little innovation, very little stretching myself, had made a good money with a comfortable house, and never like pushed the envelope,
Right.
That curious person is the one in my mind that's saying, all right, what's like next in this field, and how do I, project and propel myself into that next thing?
Right.
And so as I said, there's kind of 2 lanes, which you answered that first one. So then the second one is you spoke to a problem that you saw, and so then Carrots became the fix for that problem from a technology platform. Give us the elevator, like what is what exactly is Carrots? What's the fix what's the problem that you're solving for?
Right. Yeah. So the last question I told you, I was like fully prepared. This one I'm gonna fumble bad because I care so much about it, and we're working on it every day. But what I would say the elevator pitches, or whatever tagline I would use right now, they all require a further explanation, right? It's performance transparency. It's workplace environmental transparency. You know, it's a platform where we are desperately trying to give people, I don't want to say autonomy, but just they're in control of their own destiny, right? So we like to say that we're the Peloton for business. We're the Peloton for the workplace. So any company that has 5 or more people performing a repetitive task, those people should have scorecards. And those people should know at the end of every day, did I meet expectations? Did I surpass expectations? And this is not in any way at all meant to micromanage those people. It's actually meant to empower those people, right? So I think that I'll go back to just problems that I had and problems that I tried to solve, and then saw those problems repeating across different industries.
Yeah.
Like I said, whether that was healthcare or real estate or whatever it may have been, I found that there really was not a company I'd ever been a part of that didn't have some, varying management style, and you weren't hearing sounds of favoritism.
Yeah.
Right. And so I know that as a baseball player, again, you become a stat rat. Yeah. My favorite movie ever is Moneyball. Absolutely. I know it's very cliche, but I love the movie because I love, just the real unorthodox approach and just kind of playing the hand you're dealt and knowing that we're not the Yankees and we can't win that way. We're going to have to win a different way. And I think that at the end of the day, it's like the statistics, you had the guy saying like, oh, well, a baseball player should be 6'3", 195 pounds, and his arm should be this long, and he looks good getting off the bus. And you're like, yeah, but you can't hit, So I definitely saw that, right? Mm-hmm. And then in business, I saw the same thing. I saw someone that you didn't know when you would get a report, and you got, I had 75 exempt level managers in my last business, and I was really just a victim of what information would they give me. Was Carter a good employee? Well, were they going off of Carter truly, right, having better output, more quality output, and being better with the clients than someone else? Or was that person really good with Carter?
Yeah.
Right. And so I think that, I wanted to find a way of like I said, we love to use the term that we were the Peloton for the workplace, because at the end of every day, it's rewarding to see, okay, this is what my pace is like. Right. And so I think, said another way, there's 3 problems that Carrots is trying to solve. Number one, we studied it, and like 90% of companies are late pushing out budgets and KPIs, right? So it's the 3rd of the month, and I don't have my budget or I don't have my KPIs in front of me, if at all, right? I mean, I've seen...
And just to pause right there, KPIs, key performance indicators, anyone listening? So,
absolutely, right? And everybody calls them something different, right? Yep. I mean, key performance metrics, like whatever you want to call them. Yep. But long story short, I mean, I was around private equity owned businesses that didn't have them, just didn't have them. Wow. Like you'd walk around and you'd say, hey man, like, how do you know today, if today was a win or a loss? Well, I really don't. At the end of the day, it's like, I'm doing the best I can. And so I saw businesses, it's one thing to be a small startup retail store and not know exactly how to dial it in. You can't scale a business without that. And so problem one is people are late or inaccurately pushing those out. Number 2, there's no platform or software to engage with. There is an overabundance of data companies out there like Tableau and Salesforce, and there's a million places to go get data and information and study what's happened in your company and maybe even bridge that back to where you should be taking your company. But then there's nothing in the middle that's really saying like, okay, this is where you are. This is where you're going to go. This is how you're going to get there, right? And so we want an environment just like the Peloton screen where someone can live in that space and they can see my output every day. How do I compare versus my best month ever? How do I compare versus my best day ever? Right? And then you're in control of your own destiny. You're in this this gamified environment with yourself to beat the best version of yourself, right? And then the third thing is just the third problem, and probably the biggest one that we're trying to solve is executives and management missing key moments, right? So if I just took a deep breath and decided this May I'm going to have the best month I've ever had in my life. I'm going to go to sleep every night. I'm going to get 9 hours of sleep. I'm going to eat right. I'm going to take care of myself. I'm going to prepare myself, and I'm going to concentrate, and I'm going to break every record. And I do that, and then I don't get recognized. The odds of me running that back in June are slim.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And so I think too many times there's a number of books about the key moments in life and business. And, it's the death of a loved one, the birth of a child, hitting a work benchmark, crossing over an anniversary, and having leaders in your company miss those moments.
Right.
It's incredibly powerful.
Yep.
And so drawing that back to Carrots, there's all of this automated communication that's centered around your work performance, right? And so number one, let's push the KPIs. Number two, let's create an environment where people can engage with that and track it and own it and live in it. And then three, let's make sure that every executive in the company is getting a notification when Carter just broke his best month or hit his goal for the month. And that way, at one time, in total alignment, we can share a message back to you and tell you that we're super proud of you, and that you mean a lot to the organization. And I think that pat on the back, we talk about carrots and incentives. The reality is, I think the best carrot ever is having someone walk by you and pat you on the back and tell you they're really proud of you.
No, I think it's really cool. I mean, as you kind of alluded to there, it seems to me like most of those platforms that you see are often like sales output kind of facing.
Right.
It's all about really kind of those primary revenue drivers. But like if I was to look at Higginbotham as a whole, if you really ask me who drives the most revenue, it's really the 80% of our employees that are actually doing the majority of the work and employer interfacing.
Right.
And I think it is a problem as to like, how does that person know if they're having a good day?
Right.
And it's kind of thankless at times. So I think the problem that you're solving for, I think it's a real problem.
Yep.
And so when you first kind of had that idea, you're new to this technology silo. Your previous startup was more of a blue collar startup, and so how did you even first say, okay, I've got this idea, where do I even start? I don't know how to code. I mean, what did you do?
Yeah, great point, right? I told you my elevator pitch was messy. Like I would need like a 300-story building for that elevator ride.
Yeah.
So we tried to find a big, tall building. So when I'm on the elevator, I've got 5 minutes to talk about it. No, but fortunately, obviously going back, whatever it was, 2007, going back, I did not have a lot of software and code writing and just tech experience. And even in my last businesses, we built, platforms and apps and things like that. I was not the person, in there writing, Ruby or Java or HTML or anything like that. But, by the time I sold the company, we had been through massive ERP implementations and integrations, and we'd worked with SAP and Salesforce and Tableau and then, like I said, I think I've invested in 10 different businesses in the last 36 months, and almost every one of those businesses is on a different system, a different platform. So I've sort of been forced to live in a lot of different, application farms.
Yeah, you got a lot of cross training there.
A lot of different stuff, right? And so we've got retail businesses that everything's done in Shopify, and then we've got other businesses that are at the end of every day I'm reading a Google Doc, right? Mm-hmm. So and then everything in between. So I definitely had experience as a user, and I knew how to accomplish these things. And so just made it went from, like I said, almost a consulting initiative where I was out implementing a program like Carrots, but we weren't doing it through software. We were doing it through an Excel spreadsheet, maybe some screensaver style illustrations that would connect back to the incentives and the program that they were engaged in. And then a year had gone by, and I got a call from one of the CFOs, and he's a real cerebral, kind of dry guy, but you listen when he talks, because he doesn't talk very often, and when he does, he did his homework.
Right.
And I did not expect him to be a big fan of the Carrots sort of, not the mission, but what it was. I think he's a very, very traditional CFO, and I think he thought this is just expensive. This is just going to be something that we're doing, that we're going to pay people to do the job they're already doing. We're going to pay them more to do the job they're already doing. And I got a phone call from him one day, and he said, "Hey, we've had this in place for 8 months. One group was on it, and then we had a parallel group that we left off of it, but they do the same job,
so basically a controlled
same
group.
tenured, just a controlled environment."
Yeah.
And he calls me and he says, "Hey," and right out of his mouth, he's just like, "What are you going to charge for this?" And I'm thinking he's just like already like preparing to tell me no.
You're fired.
Right. Which I think he's just going to be like, "Well, I had invested in the company, so he wasn't going to fire me." Right. I mean, he was going to do it respectfully, but I think he was just going to say something like, "Hey, what are you going to charge for this?" And then I was going to throw a number out. I was going to say like, "Oh, like $10,000 a month," which I wasn't going to say. It was going to be like $2,500 a month for his size group. And I thought he was just whatever. I said I could have said $5, and he was going to be like, "Nope, it's not worth $5."
Right.
And then I told him, I said, I think I actually did tell him. I said, "Well, you've got 70 people on the platform, and if we're doing a traditional per seat price, I think yours is going to be about $2,400 a month." And he was like, "Dude, you could charge like 3x that." And all of a sudden, I don't remember whatever I was doing. I stopped, and I was like, I got up and I started walking around, and I was like, "Well, tell me more." And he was like, "Well, I've tried to shoot this down every which way I can." And he said, "I can't." He said, he said, "We've had a double-digit reduction in the group that had it in turnover. Wow. The other group had 7 people quit. This group had 1 person resign, and I don't even know that it was related to work. And then they outsold the other group by almost 20% collectively over the course of the 6 months." Wow. He said, "So I think we generated an incremental, like with their average transaction value, it was an incremental $1.9 million in revenue." Dang. And what we were quoting him was whatever $25,000-$30,000 a year, and he was just like,
was that kind of like an unintended consequence, the retention part? I mean, to me, when you first pitched it sounded like output, but I mean, the retention thing, that's pretty compelling.
Absolutely, right? I mean, I think that, you got to go through all of the reasons that people leave companies, right? Is the compensation model wrong? Is the recognition piece not there? Is the advancement plan and advancement transparency for someone to move up in the company not really there? Do you have weak management where they're not engaging with the employees and developing people, stimulating them, challenging them? And I'm not telling you at all that the software will do all of that for you, but it definitely creates a more consistent environment. And you got to think, I mean, what would college football be without a scoreboard? Yeah. And it's just at the end of every game, you had like a Olympic diving style panel that's like, I kind of like the way this team blocked. Let's give it to them, right? Yeah. That's what business was.
Well, now my knee hurts, but it was fun, I guess.
Yeah, right. No, I mean, like we wouldn't pay attention, and so it's, in a lot of jobs, you almost had like in an environment with no scoreboard. Yeah. And so I think that there's lots of positive byproducts of the software that we're just figuring out, right? Yeah. I mean, I think one of the really cool pieces that, some of the listeners may like is that we've started to figure out we've got a really large client that has 900 employees on the platform. Relatively high turnover. They lose about 25 people on average a month, but they're always kind of, there's a backstop there and a bench, and they're filling it back in. But we were able to see after 90 days of them being on the platform, we were like, man, let's really study the user behavior and the user habits, and then also just the output of the 20, 25 people that quit every month. And then just like you would expect, boom, we saw a pattern. And you can now almost predict, which 20 or 25 are next. And then possibly head that off. Yeah. And then either if there's someone in that group that you really don't want to lose, you can engage yourself in on day 3 of seeing this trend that typically ends in this place, and now say, hey, let's go get in front of Carter. This could be an issue, right? And and then also just sort of reverse engineer it and say, how do we keep that from happening ever, right?
Yeah.
And
so, in that vein, I kind of asked about the this silo in particular, and so you made mention of a few things. One was you kind of had a little bit of know-how from interfacing with a lot of different companies. Number two was you seemed to have that first work case where it worked, and you got some praise from a CFO that you thought may not like it. Then three, it sounds to me like a consistent theme here that you have is, again, that curiosity piece, as you've just made mention of. There's a lot of research happening even now with carrots in terms of what other problems are we solving even unintentionally. And so would you say, in terms of in the tech space, that it's really even that much different than any other space? Or is it that those same tools that enabled you to be valuable or be successful previously are now serving you really well here too?
That's a great question. I think there's always this sort of, I know for myself personally, there was always this like mystique and kind of intimidation factor when it came to technology, and there's no denying it. I mean, it's, just like medicine, you're definitely going to find some really strong academics there, right? I'm not saying that in a construction business you won't. You'll find them everywhere, right? If you find, if you're looking at a successful organization, you've got intelligent people. I know for myself, I was obviously very intimidated. You'd read about a tech startup, and you would just immediately think like, wow, those guys are brilliant, and there's brilliant people doing them for sure. Right. But I think there's also kind of like you said, maybe not standard, but there's a traditional approach to them, on the business side that, if you're just using this technology to connect back to a real life problem, that's the whole point, right? I mean, that's where we're searching for this improved world, right? Is, how do we reduce car accidents? How do we reduce food poisoning? How do we, and then tech plays a key piece in that. So I think that when you break down what you want tech to do, and I think, the more black and white and the stronger your vision is for how you want it to work and what problems you want to solve, it becomes a lot more attainable to execute that initiative, whether that's software or an app or whatever it may be. That's at least my, I mean, I was never going to be the guy to go start Google.
Right.
I don't want to take away from technology and make it seem like it's more simple than it is. But, I think for you and I to decide that we're going to go change the way that every person in the world lives and what we're doing is going to be really popular 10 years from now, we may not be that guy. Right? But, I mean, leveraging technology to solve a very specific problem, you can speak the language enough, and the project management side of building that is probably more attainable than most people would realize.
Okay, so it seems to me like there's this one theme that I'm picking up on, or maybe you could tell me if I'm right or wrong on this, is that I see oftentimes a lot of successful CEOs, successful coaches, leaders, that they do a great job of picking the right people to be on their bench. The smart person to solve this problem, that's maybe the right person on their team. Would you agree with that? I mean, in terms of how you started Carrots?
Right. I think you never want to discount people, because every company, if you don't have the right people in the right positions, you're not going to have success. But I think if you assume that's sort of a given, the two areas that when I'm investing in companies that I'm quietly really sort of trying to figure out, I guess, issues you don't want to see, right? Are does this person, do they know exactly what it is they're trying to do? And like I said earlier, from a measurable standpoint, the one piece of business advice I give, anyone that's asking me for mentorship, or, oddly enough, I've been asked to go to some universities that
that's your first time to do that, right?
Well, had I applied to some of the schools that I've been able to speak at, I would not have been accepted. So I tell people all the time, like, I'm speaking at a school that turned me down. This is pretty funny, you know. And all of the kids, make substantially better grades than you do, and then you're standing there speaking to them. But I tell them all the time, you can't manage what you don't measure. And if you think you're a great manager, but you're not, you don't have these like very dialed in, scorecards or you're just however you like to view things, and it's very data driven.
Yeah.
You don't have to be a data scientist, but if you don't have measurables and you're not managing the business through metrics, then you're managing it through feel, and feel won't scale.
Sure.
And then the other thing is just that I think is probably the biggest sin for like you go back and you talked about, people, you definitely can't miss, if you've got 5 employees and you miss on one, you may not get off the ground, right?
Yeah.
If you got 500 employees and you miss on one, you're not probably going to notice the difference.
Yeah.
But I definitely think that early on, if you just assume that that's a given, an incomplete vision will kill you. And you may think, well, who in the world would go start a company with an incomplete vision? Lots of people. Lots of people. And I think they think, I've got 60% of a really good idea, or I've got 70% of how this should be done. It's your job to have 100%.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, if you're now gonna raise money or waste people's time or hire people, you better have a really strong vision of how it's going to go. Doesn't mean you have to be exactly right on all of it, but you need to be close enough that you can sort of start to dial it in and just make minor revisions and calibrations.
Yeah.
But I can't tell you how many times I see someone walk in, and the more that you start to question it, there's a little bit of they're expecting to make a key hire and then that person figure this thing out.
Yeah.
Or they're going to outsource something to a vendor and then that vendor is going to figure something out. I think it's sort of reckless and irresponsible if you don't have a complete vision of how something's going to go. Now, as soon as it starts to take shape and form, you want that inclusivity. You want people to be able to exchange ideas and things like that. But you can't have a startup from scratch and think like, well, I'm almost there.
Yeah, man, that's awesome. That's super powerful. I mean, something that I actually think you have this about you, and I hope this is a compliment, is I often say that if you don't believe in you, who will? So when you walk into a room, when you're meeting with someone, when you're pitching that vision, if you don't have it 100% figured out, or at least portray that you have it 100% figured out, then no one's going to believe in you.
Right.
And I think you definitely have that about you. And I think you're right that that's a powerful tool for any CEO, any startup guy. I mean, in a lot of ways, you are that coach. You're the one that's getting buy-in.
Right.
And, you've been in the room with the coach that you're like, I don't believe this guy.
Yeah. Right. No, absolutely. I mean, I think probably my least favorite saying in business is fake it till you make it.
Yeah.
We all know that sometimes there's an element of that that's
Right.
I mean, the last year, right? If you're in supply chain management and you're getting phone calls every day about when is my stuff going to ship, and everybody's affected by inventory, you're doing your best. And there's probably some people saying like they're kind of trying to speak it into existence that it's
Right.
going to work. Fake it till you make it.
Yeah.
I think fortunately I've been very blessed to be in a situation that it didn't necessarily have to be an operator again. I this time I want to do this. I chose to do this.
Yeah.
Didn't have to work. And I think I laughingly told like one of my lawyers that I said, if I have to fake it, I won't make it. That's my new saying.
Nice.
Because I'm in a position right now I don't have to do that, right?
Yep.
So
Yeah.
and until I have something that keeps me up at night and just going to eat me up if I don't do it, then I'm not going to do it, right?
Yeah.
So that saying is now kind of flip-flop for me, right? Because I definitely, I go back, I was 26, 27 years old when I started Fan Cloth, and, man, I really had no idea what I was doing, right? I mean, I knew that people would want this, and I knew if I was able to execute on it, but, I mean, we were definitely, like, a day-to-day business. And so, now I don't want to do that again.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, your story is an awesome one. It's super compelling. I think one thing that I'm going to steal from you now is that feel won't scale. That's kind of been a theme that you've had here, from talking about carrots to the traditional way of baseball scouting to identifying, a next successful CEO, that feel won't scale. And so I think that's a pretty cool theme. So you touched on two things. You touched on your blue collar business you started. You've touched on your early success and what you're building at Carrot. So let's just start with one and just simplify it, make it as granular and simple as you can. With, to start a blue collar business, I'm an entrepreneur. What do I need to know? What do I need to do?
Yeah, so I think about blue collar, I tend to just immediately go service, at least I do. I think that probably very common to the things we've been talking about today, I think it really helps when you have like a burning desire to solve a problem. I've got this corny little, like I said, I wasn't classically trained. I didn't go to Wharton, didn't go to Yale. So a lot of these little mechanisms and processes that I've created for myself, they were just, I didn't know any different, so I came up with something. And I'm lucky enough that I get to see a lot of deals.
Yeah.
So I get a lot of decks, a lot of presentations, a lot of lunches where someone's making an intro to someone. So I started my own little grid, right, where I've got 4 squares, and then in those squares, I say need, okay, and the top square is need, and then I say skill, and then scalability, and then finances. And each one of those 4 boxes, I grade 1 to 10.
Nice.
And then hopefully something meets the sort of proper number to then move forward with that process. The most important one to me is need. So whether it's blue collar or white collar business, but definitely blue collar, does the world really need it? And if you really think about it, there's so much has already been done. We're living in a sort of copycat environment, right? Where somebody has success in any industry and it gets publicized, everyone wants to copy it.
Yeah.
And so you have to be really honest with yourself about whatever I'm about to go do, especially from a sustainability, right? When you're thinking about the environment and just how well will the business sustain, and what is the positive or negative sort of byproduct of what I'm about to go do, I think you better be able to look yourself in the mirror and say the world really needs this, right? Because you don't have the right to just do something because someone else did it. That doesn't make you good at it, right? And so that's why I kind of go through on a scale of 1 to 10 on need. I really want that to be high. If I can't go home and say, this is an 8 or better, I probably don't even move forward with looking at that deal.
Sure.
And I use the scoring system on myself. If I'm going to go embark on like starting a company, I need to pass that scoring system, right? And like I said, so I think it goes from, how much does the world need it, to skill, are you the right person to do it?
Right.
Am I the right person to do it? Is there someone better than me that could or should be doing it? I think those are 2 really important questions to ask yourself when you go to start something. Now, you guys work with a lot of smart people, and I think that if somebody's already to that point where they're doing that, then they're responsible and they should move forward with their idea. But I definitely think, like we talked about, making key hires, making sure you understand at least the first 6 months to a year what you're trying to accomplish.
Right.
And then just trying to win every day, just waking up and just winning it, one day, one customer, one retention at a time.
Yeah, that's awesome. Okay, so the graph, that's super cool, powerful. I'm sure we're going to see a lot of copycats now on that. So you might want to trademark that one. But so now, all right, tech, white collar, is it different? Are you looking for something different? Would you encourage an entrepreneur in that space that there's something that different, or is it the same?
I think that in some cases the capital requirement may be a little bit different. I think trying to it's probably a little tougher to go just right off of the street to walking into it, like if it's a firm or an agency or a resource, a highly skilled developer. A developer right now, a multi-language developer, is not looking for work.
Yeah.
So in order to get their attention and engage with them, your idea needs to be strong, right? When you peel the onion back, white collar, blue collar, you're trying to solve a problem, right? And the more prominent the problem is and the stronger your solution is, the more viable the business is going to become. And so I think that, they both begin and end with, I want to make something better. Now, I think in the middle there, your capital requirements, your resources, those are going to vary. I'm not the ultimate believer that you've got to have the best business plan in the world to go have a successful business. We've all heard stories of people that had no business plan whatsoever. I don't think in my last business I ever really wrote a true business plan, but you do need to have a plan. You may not have to have a business plan if you're not going out raising money and doing all that stuff, but you better have a plan. You need to know exactly from a process standpoint early on, this is how our process is going to flow, and this is how I'm going to generate new clients. This is how I'm going to make sure that their engagement and the value they see in us is just only going up, and we're strengthening that. But I think both businesses, they kind of start in a similar place. They then sort of balloon out and maybe a little bit different tactically, but then eventually they land right back in the same point of, like, once the business is up and running, how do I keep providing more value to my clients year over year over year?
Yeah, That's cool, man. It comes back to what you spoke to earlier of CEO better know what the problem is, and he better have a really hard grasp on that.
Right. I think it's really, really easy these days because whether you're on Twitter or Instagram or Facebook or whatever, YouTube, it's so easy to get caught up in just this entrepreneurial vibe that's going on, and you feel like you're missing out if you're not starting a company. And I mean, it's not for everyone. And I think you've heard this before, but you're never really your own boss. I think the first question I ask when I've done some of the speaking engagements like you talked about is, I'll go to speak at like a group that's getting an MBA in entrepreneurship, and they want to ask me certain questions, and I'll start with like, hey, I want everyone to stand up that is here because they want to be their own boss. And then I politely really tell those people, like, you should walk out now. Like, you can sit back down, but really you should be walking out because you'll never be your own boss. Like, if you really are like sort of like, your integrity is aligned and like where it should be, you'll never be your own boss, right? I mean, I think I probably have more bosses right now than I've ever had in my life because I've invested in more companies. I work for the CEOs and the teams that I invest in. I work for the clients that pay them. So I think if you take the approach that, everyone who's paying you is your boss, you're going to end up running a pretty good company.
Yeah.
I think if you're out there and your number one driver and trying to start a business is like you want to be the person in charge,
sure,
it's probably not a company I'm going to want to work for, or you.
Yeah.
So
man, that's a great spot for a Higginbotham plug. Our COO or former COO, who's one of the founders of our company, Jim Hubbard, he always says we work for the client. We don't work for each other. We don't work for Higginbotham. We work for the client. And I think that is, a very common thread I see in successful businesses that I work with is that just how are we improving the client experience every single day?
Right.
Yeah.
I think you can tell really distinctly too, just in your everyday life as you go about, I'm going to stop here and get my car washed. I'm going to go here and get coffee. I'm going to go to this hotel when I travel. You can really tell right off the bat which companies are of that mindset and which ones have maybe gotten too much into their own sort of ideas and they're not as focused as they used to be on serving the customer.
Yeah. Yeah, that's powerful.
So I think you got to. I think that one never changes.
Yep.
That should be the number one driver on why you started a company. And 10, 15 years into it, you should be even more dialed in and more sincere about trying to solve those problems.
From an insurance perspective, you've been with the 1,000 Life Group. You've been in the startup world. If you could see something change in the insurance world, what would that be? Or maybe even you can speak to just what are some of the problems you've seen. Maybe with the industry, anything in that realm. I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, there's probably the bigger chunk of my career, 10 years, we were a relatively large organization. So, hovering between 750 to, the parent company that purchased my old business, I think we probably had 10,000, 11,000 people. And so, those are sort of unicorns, right? I know that's not everyone's business, but those organizations were really challenging. And I think you and I have had this conversation before that I remember, every year having to do open enrollment in 5, I think one time even 6 languages. And I think the unique thing about our business was, there's a lot of companies that have 1,000 people that are spread out. We had 1,000 people in 3 buildings next to each other. So we were I saw everyone every day.
Right. Yeah.
And so when you're going around with translators and the degrees of knowledge about insurance, you probably could have walked into any department with every person in the company and said, what does Carter do? What does Ted do? What does Lisa do? And they could speak somewhat, intelligently about what everyone else in the company did. And now you say, everyone speak about insurance. And on a scale of 1 to 10, they'd be about a 2. Right? And I just think that everyone's experiences in their previous companies is so unique and so different. Right? Mm-hmm. And so I know that it was, even myself as the CEO, I definitely didn't do everything that I needed to do in the early years of my career to sort of empathize with our employees and understand how important that was. And I think that leaders and companies need to do a way better job, as painful as it may be, and as much as it doesn't feel like there's any ROI connected to it, there is. You need to sit down with your people in all different departments, and you need to have a better survey process, a better questionnaire process, a better way of retrieving information. I think that oftentimes, this is going to be really unpopular and sort of polarizing what I'm about to say, but I oftentimes think that executives and companies sort of bend the narrative to support their own initiative when it comes to benefits. Yeah. And I think we need to start thinking, really truly thinking about what's best for me, and maybe this category that I hear from and spend the most time with is not at all representational of what's best for this other group. And so I think just, and I'll be the first to say that I'm talking to my younger self when I say that. So there's some amazing leaders and executives and CEOs out there that light years ahead of where I was. But I think that's my advice to younger or newer leaders inside of companies is just take your time, do your diligence, make sure you're getting the right advice and second opinions, and you do what's best for your organization. If you don't take care of your people, they can't take care of your clients, and that's a problem. So probably the number one single area in business that I've evolved the most is just understanding insurance and benefits and that educational process that needs to take place for your employees.
Man, that's awesome. You alluded to Starbucks earlier. One of the Howards wrote a book called It's Not About the Coffee. And it was just about that idea of the people. And he was really the one that was banging the drum of the importance of benefits to each one of their employees, which everyone knows that's one of the hallmarks of Starbucks today.
Absolutely.
And then, on our side, I can see and completely agree with what you're saying, that anymore, so often I'm talking to CEOs and telling them your greatest job in benefits now, more than anything, is educating your employees as to how they can be the most effective consumers of healthcare. So that means, for them, how do I accomplish what I want to accomplish from a benefits perspective, from a taking care of my family perspective, with spending the least amount of money and getting the highest quality care. And so that's exactly what you're speaking to. If we can move that 2, as you alluded to, on the 1 to 10 scale up to a 6, 7, to where your employees feel like, I know what our benefits are, I know how to interact with them, it's a strong benefit that I've been given by my employer, that can really change the game for a company culture.
Absolutely. And I just think don't underestimate how big of a life change a little change in your plan may be.
Yeah.
Right. I think that's a really important thing. It's just like a process change in a department, right? It may not be a big deal to you as the supervisor. You say, hey, today, we've always done everything left to right. Today we're going to do it right to left, and then you walk out of the room. You don't think it's that big a deal,
right?
People are going to melt down, right? I mean, you're going to lose an hour or 2 hours a day. Now think about benefits times 10. Right. You may not think it's a big deal. You had the 3 months of consultations to know what's out there, and the previous history that your company had, and you were able to review that and then make an educated decision. And then all of a sudden you take what was 3 months of an education that your team gave you, and then you give your people a 30-minute explanation on why you switched, and now you're Blue Cross Blue Shield, and you don't think it's a big deal because you had that that backstory. I'll try to make this really short, but I think you'll find this a very parallel analogy. I have a great friend that is one of the best storytellers I've ever heard in my life. Like I always say, he could sit and just talk to us about watching that grass grow, and you'll hang on to every word he says. A lot of his businesses have not had the level of success I thought they would, because when you sit in the room with him, he's so dynamic. But you got to have the backstory. And then if you take something to market and then he's not the one telling that story and you don't have the backstory, that doesn't translate into success. Yeah. And I think it's the same in healthcare. That your executives had 3 months of diligence in storytelling, and we know why this all happened. And then you cram that into a 30-minute session on, to your employees about what we're about to do. Sure. And I think it's just too often we're kind of not as thoughtful as we should be when it comes to our employees, and you got to do what you got to do. I mean, people need to make change. This plan may not be the best for you this year. They still deserve the respect of knowing why. And I think if they know the backstory as to why we're making this change and why this change is important, you'll get buy-in. Yeah. But I know that, probably the two biggest regretful moments in my career, we made a really big drastic change with our healthcare and didn't do nearly a good enough job kind of hand-holding and educating. And, I spent the next 3 weeks doing a really, really messy cleanup project.
Yeah.
So,
man, I think that's a great word for everyone listening, as well as for each of us as brokers at Higginbotham, just to remember the importance of that, how much it does impact those people. I mean,
and don't just assume that everything you're telling this person is making its way down.
Yeah.
I think that's what we found out, right? Is like, you may have done a phenomenal job talking to me about it, and then you just assume that I did as good of job talking about it, and it just gets watered down.
Right.
So, if you didn't do a really aligned process and push, then you'd be shocked at how this group received it really well and understands it. And then there's these 200 people over here that are really angry, and they didn't have any explanation.
Sure.
So I think, just everyone from, you and myself, just making sure that we've got a very prepared, aligned message that gets pushed all the way down.
Yeah. That's awesome. Well, Nick, thank you for the time. I think it's been a super valuable conversation, I know, for me and for all of our listeners. I look forward to kind of hearing response from people and, to seeing the success that Carrots has, just like the rest of your business has. So, man, we appreciate it for sure.
Awesome. I appreciate it.